Welcome. My name is Ignacio Packer, and I have the privilege of being the executive director of ICVA. You have joined ICVA's annual conference, and during the sessions today and tomorrow, we will focus on the role that NGOs will play in adapting the way we work to be better prepared to climate and environmental shocks. Before we get started, I invite you to watch this video.
Yeah, I think it's really sick.
Es porque no la cuidan bien.
Para cuidar a la madre tierra, primero pensando que es mi cuerpo mismo.
Que dejen de hacer cosas malas, porque así no sanan a la tierra.
No fumiguen porque muere mucha gente por eso y hace muy mal, obviamente.
Recoger la basura y plantar árboles.
Si el hombre no hubiera cortado los árboles, el suelo no estaría enfermo. Esto es un arroyo. Estaría así. Estaría con agua y nosotros no estaríamos acá. O sea, no estarían acá viéndome.
En mi escuela hay una compostera y los más chiquititos no saben qué es una compostera. Entonces, yo les explico.
Every minute, 1 ton of rubbish is deposited into the ocean.
Yo quisiera vivir en un planeta sin contaminación, un planeta que esté sano, y me gustaría que fuera sin violencia.
Tal vez en 100 años ya no vivamos aquí.
This video is from Child to Child and React. So 2 NGOs creating space where children and young people are listened to and taken seriously in the exercise of their rights in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The consequences of the climate and environment crisis are affecting children the most and threatening their health, education, protection, and their very survival. Children are essential actors in responding to the climate crisis. We must be attentive to the voices of the children as they express their concerns for the world they live in now and their dreams of the world in which they want to live. We should listen to words such as those of the children on the video that not only manifest extraordinary wisdom and knowledge, but also insight into possible solutions. Children carry messages of hope and a vision of a healthier planet. We are in a climate and environment emergency. The unfolding emergency is adding an additional layer of stress to humanitarian action, to humanitarian organizations, and we are already stretched thinner than ever before. Recent scientific evidence has reinforced and in some cases exceeded our worst fears about the physical impact facing us. Flooding, disease and famine, resulting in migration on an unprecedented scale in areas of already high tension, drought and crop failure, leading to intensified competition for food, water and energy in regions where resources are already stretched to the limit. Economic disruption. Climate and environment crises pose escalating risks to stability and security. COVID-19 has further reminded us of the intimate relationship between people and nature. It has reminded us of being humble and that solutions should leave no one behind in our fragile and increasingly interdependent world. Sustainable solutions can only be collective and global. The ICVA annual conference is global with over 1,500 registrations following here or following online from over 120 countries. We have registrations from Belarus, Chad, Iran, Kyrgyzstan, Timor-Leste, Venezuela, Malawi, Ethiopia, OPT, Cuba, Gambia, Fiji, and of course the list is very long. Of the 7 top countries in terms of number of registrations, Bangladesh, Kenya, France, Nigeria, US, UK, and Switzerland. Data show we are gender balanced in terms of registration. Participants are ICVA members, other NGOs, NGO fora, states, donors, UN agencies, experts, and other climate and environment sector stakeholders. A warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining. Now, hope for change underpins much of humanitarian work. It underpins much of the extraordinary lives of ordinary people in affected communities. From hurricanes to droughts, to floods, to wildfires, the consequences of the climate and environment crisis are all around us, and we don't always know what is going to happen, or how, or exactly when. That very uncertainty is the space of hope. Hope has nothing to do with positive news, nor buying a lottery ticket. It is something that has to boil in each and every one of us. Hope is linked to action. Our actions and that of others along us. To earn hope, we need together to roll up our sleeves. We have to roll up our sleeves. To have positive expectations about the future, hope has to be driven by our capacity to identify goals and set strategies to achieve them. This capacity lies outside existing silos and requests for humanitarian, development, and climate communities to efficiently work together to shape policy, increase resilience, improve practice. For the people in the front lines, when survival is the #1 priority, the future you need to solve is today. Hope may then seem a bit of a luxury. The impacts of climate change are disproportionately experienced by people in vulnerable situations. Among those in greatest need of protection, internally displaced people, refugees, migrants in vulnerable situations, stateless persons, including women, children, as mentioned earlier, older persons, people with disabilities, LGBTQI+ people, indigenous peoples. And women are often the key providers of food, water, and energy. And at the same time, they bear the brunt of the climate crisis. They are critical to crafting climate solutions that are often marginalized from climate leadership, whether at the grassroots, regional, or national levels. What is needed now is transformational change. In this spirit, ICVA, at its 18th General Assembly last week, stepped up its commitment and ambition to meet the humanitarian and protection challenge already being amplified by the climate and environment emergency, and to mitigate and prepare for those to come. The ICVA 2030 strategy, adopted by the General Assembly, presents transformations of which addressing the impact of climate change on humanitarian action. The ICVA General Assembly also adopted commitments and motion to action on environment. climate and humanitarian action, which includes the ICVA network signing on the Climate and Environmental Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. These are 7 commitments aiming to galvanize and steer collective humanitarian action in response to these crises. You will be hearing more on these points during the conference. On the agenda of the conference, the first session, Scene, to start just in a couple of minutes, we'll look at the intersection between humanitarian, climate, and environment's action. Session 2, later today, is in breakout groups, world cafes with 10 initiatives. And then tomorrow, session 3, Camera, will focus on the localization and funding linkages. And the session 4, Action, tomorrow as well, we look at how different sectors could work together. As you see, choices have been made for this second ICVA online annual conference on climate, environment, and humanitarian action. This is only part of the needed conversations geared to urgent collective action. The agenda has been shaped with the inputs from many of you, including from 500 survey respondents registered to the conference, coming from 89 countries. The conversation will cover issues around maximizing the environmental sustainability of our work and rapidly reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. But it is today primarily about stepping up our response to growing humanitarian needs and helping people adapt to the impacts of climate and environmental crisis. The annual conference is about rolling up our sleeves within our work environment. And this goes with the expectations, the hope that we are rolling up our sleeves also as right holders, as we the peoples, and as consumers, with a moral obligation to our children and to future generations. We have to change individually for this needed transformation, and this is not necessarily comfortable. The moderator of this first session is Paul Knox-Clark. Paul has worked in a number of conflict environments. He was lead author of the 2018 State of the Humanitarian System report. Paul, you are now leading the Climate and Humanitarian Crisis Initiative. And before you start introducing the panelists of the first session and asking them questions, could you give just an elevator's pitch on the new platform you are leading? Elevator's pitch as we were in a small building, not a skyscraper.
Thank you, Ignacio.
Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. And can I just say how exciting it is to see colleagues from all over the world joining in with the chat. I think this is a really excellent example of what can be done online. And I'd commend you also for the translation and the signing, which I think is really superb. So well done to ICVA for that. Yes, thank you. The Climate and Humanitarian Crisis Initiative comes from the observation that, of course, we now know that the climate emergency is going to lead to more crises, bigger crises, and more complex crises. And it doesn't seem that the humanitarian and emergency response sectors are yet at the scale or have yet taken this on board fully in terms of how they think about how they work. There is excellent work, of course, as we'll see later in the conference, going on around resilience and going on around anticipatory humanitarian action. And hopefully these are very important approaches to addressing the crises of climate change. But we also know that they won't work in all contexts and for all people. The particularly challenges in fragile states and particularly challenges with hard to predict and complex crises. And so we also feel that as well as the work around resilience, anticipatory action, significant work is required around humanitarian preparedness and response to fulfill that suite of humanitarian activities. So the CHC is a new platform. It exists to bring various and diverse organizations together to jointly clarify this humanitarian challenge, to identify concrete changes that need to be made, and to provide change management support to organizations and to the system to enable those changes to happen, ideally very quickly, because this is a huge tidal wave that's bearing down on us. Anyone who's interested to find out more about the initiative, I'd invite you to, prior to the website being set up, to contact me. That's Paul at chcinitiative.org, or to look at the CHC initiative page on LinkedIn. So enough about the CHC initiative. I think, Ignacio, we're going straight to the first session. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's all yours, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's not often that Ignacio says that. So welcome everybody to this opening session of the ICVA conference. I think we're all here because we know that climate change the climate crisis is going to change almost every aspect of our lives. And that, of course, the effects of climate change will be felt most powerfully and first by the most marginalized and vulnerable in our global community. So as humanitarians, we have the simultaneous challenge of addressing, of being human beings at this time in history, the challenge that all of our generation faces, as well as the specific professional challenge that Ignacio was talking about, of how are we going to respond to this emergency in such a way as to save lives and livelihoods and enhance human dignity. It's a big ask. So to open and frame the discussions over the next couple of days, and maybe to suggest some of the themes that hopefully can be explored in more depth as we move forward today and tomorrow, ICVA has invited 4 marvelous speakers who you can see the photographs of on this slide here, and we'll meet in a minute in the flesh, as it were, or in the virtual flesh. Let me introduce them, starting with Sinead Walsh. Sinead has been Ireland's climate envoy since 2020. Prior to this, she served as the European Union ambassador to South Sudan. She's worked for Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs since 2009 and was a senior fellow at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative in 2016-17. Prior to this, Sinead served as the ambassador of Ireland to Sierra Leone and Liberia and the head of Irish Aid in both countries, based in Freetown. Before joining government, Sinead spent 10 years in the NGO sector, predominantly with Concern Worldwide, where she worked in India, Pakistan, Rwanda, and South Sudan, as well as in a global advocacy role. She has a BA from Harvard University, an MSc in Development Studies from University College Dublin, and a doctorate in social policy from the London School of Economics. She is also the co-author of Getting to Zero, a doctor and a diplomat on the Ebola front line. Welcome, Sinead, and thank you so much for taking time out to join us. I would also like to introduce Mr. Solomon Bhaghabhonerano, and I hope, Solomon, you will forgive me for what I'm sure is a lousy pronunciation. Solomon is a professional environmentalist, climate change action advocate, and humanitarian. Originally from the DRC, he now lives in Uganda, where he's a refugee. Solomon is founder and executive director of Living Green, Living Wealth Youth Initiative, an NGO he founded in 2017. The mission of the NGO is to eradicate poverty, food insecurity, and to foster a high quality of life for people while safeguarding the long-term environmental sustainability. The organization conducts a wide variety of environmental and livelihood programs in the Kiaka 2 refugee settlement in southwest Uganda, and Solomon is going to tell us a little bit more about some of those programs as we move into our discussions in a minute. Now, let me introduce Tasneem Essop, who is currently Executive Director of the Climate Action Network International. She's just completed her second term as Commissioner in the National Planning Commission in South Africa, appointed by the President, where she led work on climate change and the just transition. She previously headed the climate team in WWF International and served as the head of delegation for WWF at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Tasneem became a member of Provincial Parliament in the Western Cape in South Africa in 1994 and held positions of Provincial Minister for Transport, Public Works and Property Management from 2001 to 4, and Provincial Minister for the Environment, Planning and Economic Development to 2008. She had been an anti-apartheid activist from an early age in different capacities until the democratic elections in 1994. Welcome, Tasneem. It's marvelous to have for us humanitarians a view, as it were, from the wider climate community. And finally, I'd like to introduce Magnhild Vasset, who is the Executive Director of Field Operations Department in the Norwegian Refugee Council, an independent humanitarian organization helping people forced to flee that I'm sure many of us are very aware of. In NRC, she manages field operations from the organization's head office in Oslo, Norway, as well as NRC's 4 regional offices across the areas of operation in over 30 countries. Magnhild has previously worked with OCHA and NRC in, among other places, Kosovo, Uzbekistan, Uganda, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Liberia. So what a marvelous panel. If we were in a room, I would invite you to put your hands together for our panel. We'll have to do that virtually instead, but we're delighted that they're here. As I introduce and ask these questions, please feel free to put your own questions to our panel into the Q&A. So, with no further ado, let's go to those questions. And the question I'd like to ask you all first is this: how is and how will the climate crisis impact humanitarian action? What is the current and future impact of the climate crisis on humanitarian action? Solomon, maybe I could go to you first.
Oh, thank you very much, Paul, and all the listeners and viewers of today's program. I'm going to be brief to respond to that question. Currently, climate crisis has got a very big impact on lives of people, mainly here in the settlement, whereby access like water, fuel, wood, construction materials, and the other sources of food. Now, this has led even to mainly youth walking long distances in search of fuel wood, and sometimes they face even sexual assaults when they are. And sometimes some of the school-going children end up missing classes because they move long distances in search of water.
Oh, that is a shame. Solomon, we're going to come back to you in a minute. I'm going to ask our technical help and experts here to see if there's anything they can do to improve the line, because I think there's some key messages from the climate frontline that you are able to give us there. So if colleagues could work with Solomon to try and improve that connection somehow, maybe we could go straight to you, Magnhild, for the same question from the NRC perspective. How is climate change currently, and how will climate change affect humanitarian action?
Thank you, Paul, and a very, very good and timely question. For NRC, as an agency that is focusing on displacement, the climate crisis is one of the greatest challenges, both as a cause of new displacement and because of the challenges it presents to the displaced population during displacement and in their pursuit of durable solutions. In 2020, disasters triggered 3/4 of the new displacement recorded worldwide by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, accounting for over 40 million new displacements. And more than 95% of these displacements were the results of climate and weather-related hazards such as storms and floods. And further, the majority of refugees and internally displaced people originate from and live in climate hotspots and are exposed to severe floods, heat waves, and droughts. And as global temperatures continue to rise, the frequency and the intensity of climate-related disasters will increase, leading to more and more people being displaced and affected. On the slow onset, climate change impacts are also playing an important role in making the lives of those affected by displacement more difficult. These impacts slowly erodes people's assets and livelihoods and contributing to greater vulnerability. And the slow onset changes may also exacerbate conflict indirectly in context with high political and social inequality, and where there is existing tension over natural resources. And as an example, each of the world's 8 worst food crises in 2018 experienced the double impact of conflict and climate shocks, which led to significant increases in the severity of acute food insecurity. So, to sum up, climate change is a humanitarian problem. The climate crisis is a crisis amplifier and a multiplier that can contribute to both displacement and conflict. And it's therefore extremely important and urgent that we as humanitarian actors will increase our attention to and efforts to address this challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnhild. And I will be coming back to you in a minute for your suggestions as to how we can address that challenge. But before we do that, I'd like to go to you, Tasneem, if we might. Now, Tasneem, of course, you're not coming from inside, if you like, the humanitarian fishbowl. You're looking at the climate emergency comprehensively across all of its facets. So I wonder how you see the climate crisis currently and in future affecting humanitarian and crisis conditions. Tasneem.
Thank you, Paul, and greetings to everybody. So I do think that, previous speakers has already stressed the issue of the climate crisis being an accelerator of existing crises. 90% of disasters are climate related now. I think it's really critical that this conference is having this conversation because we're living through the experiences of compounding crises. In 2020, we were knocked with a global health pandemic. COVID, just reached, global pandemic dimensions. And in 2020, we also witnessed and experienced a number of extreme weather disasters that just continued to compound that existing crisis. So, it's really good. I hope Solomon comes back into the conversation, but this has been made sharply visible. What I really want to emphasize, though, is something that Ignacio had said in his introduction, that these compounding crises are differentiated in terms of both its impact and in terms of its causes. So it's clear that those who are most vulnerable and marginalized in society, those who are living on the front lines, and Ignacio has mentioned who these marginalized communities are. But if you imagine, for example, a community that's marginalized and vulnerable, women and children, people with disabilities, especially Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, those living in conflict areas, trying to cope with a COVID pandemic, getting hit by a cyclone or flooding, and you're still struggling to deal with the COVID crisis. So the climate crisis clearly and very sharply, for us at least, through 2020 and 2021, highlighted a number of issues. One, unbelievable levels of inequity in the world, very sharply pointed out. And I think, the humanitarian sector is at the coalface of these disasters and in their, dealing with the responses, and would have witnessed this directly. You cannot ignore that. I would argue, therefore, that the humanitarian sector's role in dealing with these multiple crises, and particularly the climate crisis, would need to much more strongly identify the intersectionalities of all these crises and have voice around it. And very importantly, have voice about the inequitable impacts that people are feeling. Those who are least responsible, as we say very often in the climate movement, those who are least responsible for the climate crisis are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis and other crises. So the connections between the climate crisis, the social crises, and the humanitarian crisis is something that we have to deeply connect. Obviously, we're responding as the humanitarian crisis, we're responding immediately to events that require attention and response. But we also have to look at the full spectrum, because it's just going to get worse. And many people have spoken about, we're just seeing the beginnings. It is going to become far more challenging as this crisis deepens, and the science is obviously sending us clear warnings about the climate crisis, and even, things in terms of timing that we thought might happen in the distant future is already starting to happen now. And if you're following all the climate science, you will see that. So an already overstretched humanitarian sector going to become increasingly overstretched. Resources going to be depleted. In such a context, we have to go to the very source of the problem as well. So not only do we need to, of course, up our game in terms of the responses and dealing with disaster and humanitarian crises, we have to also look at the full spectrum. And I would argue that we have to do the best we can to minimize the threat in the first place. And so this is where the humanitarian sector, I would argue, has an important voice, being at the coalface, of calling on especially those who have been responsible for the crisis to start addressing the crisis as if it is an emergency and an existential crisis. So we have to reduce our emissions. We have to move away from the drivers of climate change, like, the production of fossil fuels, the use of fossil fuels, and other contributing drivers. So for me, the whole spectrum of action is going to be needed, because we are going to experience much more extreme crises and compounding crises as we go forward.
Thank you, Tasneem. And in a minute, I'm going to come on and ask you more about some of these ideas for the humanitarian sector that you've suggested around advocacy, I think, around actually our role in mitigating the climate crisis. But before we do that, I understand that Solomon is back, and I really hope we're going to be able to hear you better now, Solomon. We might keep it just to audio, not turn the video on, because that will give us, I think, better bandwidth. But you were telling us about the effects of the climate emergency on people living around you, about the effects on their livelihoods, difficulties getting firewood, water, difficulties, knock-on difficulties in going to school. Please take up from where we left off, Solomon, if we can.
Oh, thank you. I'm back now. We also have issue of food insecurity, because like here in Africa, mainly I talk about Uganda. You find where refugees are living, they all live in rural areas, and they depend on subsistence farming as their main source of livelihood. So, but because of climate change, now the soils are now unproductive. We find there is a very high reduction in agricultural yields, which are exposing people into hunger and poverty at large. So, and you find also we have now started experiencing some more health issues like diseases coming up. So they are all affecting people around Uganda or worldwide at large. So these are all attributed to the climate change that we are experiencing right now, because some respiratory diseases which are being inquired as, you see, since there are no fuel wood, some of the people even resort to using like plastics to get as a source of energy for cooking. So such items expose them to respiratory diseases. And we have got chances, maybe when it floods too much, there are issues of cholera outbreak. So such diseases are being experienced here largely.
Solomon, I think that's a really pertinent example of one of the themes which has come up from other speakers around the way that climate change creates this terrible vicious cycle where, you've talked about people around you who are increasingly unable to make a living, unable to buy firewood or gather firewood, having to go further to get firewood. The firewood is not there. That then leads to burning rubbish and creation of health issues. And time again, we see that climate change is not just one thing, it is a series of steps towards greater poverty and greater suffering for many people. So thank you for that, Solomon. We'll come back in a second to ask you what you think the humanitarian system can do about this. But before that, I'd like to go to you, Sinead, if I may. Very much a different perspective, the perspective from, if you like, the Security Council, the international, interstate orientation towards climate change. You're sitting there, you're involved in these discussions. From that perspective, what do you see the current and future implications of the climate crisis are for humanitarians?
No, thanks, Paul. And I actually think that 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 this theme has come up in everybody's intervention, and that's really the issue around security and the impacts that climate change is having on security. I think it's not a coincidence that of the 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change, 12 are in active armed conflict. So I think that, I know we use the word nexus probably far too much, but that nexus of those two issues, I think, is very much evident on the ground. I myself, as you mentioned, Paul, most recently was based in South Sudan, and I think for people in South Sudan, in Somalia, in the Sahel, and so many people who are online, it is just incredibly obvious that the more the pressure grows on resources, as the colleagues have talked about, the more likely it is that tensions grow and that conflict can begin or be exacerbated. So back to Tasneem's point about the threat multiplier. We're involved in a working group on the UN Security Council on this, because Ireland is an elected member for 2 years. And I'll maybe talk a little bit about that later. But in one of the meetings that we had earlier this year, we really kind of did a deep dive into some of these issues in the Sahel. And we found that, the big issues were, precisely that pastoralist, agriculturalist, conflict, traditional agreements that might have worked fine in terms of, who could graze where, when, very much breaking down in the context of these issues. Also, just issues around social cohesion, really problematic in the Sahel. And the third issue that was quite prominent was an acceleration of rural to urban migration, which again, is leading to more, kind of more tensions and more competition over resources. So I think, we've heard from the other colleagues that, climate change, there are sort of maybe more direct impacts that we see very clearly around disasters happening and, people migrating and so on and needing humanitarian assistance. But there is also what is sometimes a slower burn. It's not always slow, but sometimes it's a slower, less visible linkage with insecurity. And, I think it will, certainly it is already leading to more and more people needing humanitarian assistance. There was just another aspect to it that I thought was really interesting, which is around protection, and Solomon referred to this, in terms of, people, women, girls, often having to travel further and further to get, less and less firewood and the kind of protection issues there. And actually IUCN did a report which I found that talked about, there was evidence that there was an increase in human trafficking, transactional sex, sexual and gender-based violence, directly, related to some of these tensions over resources from climate change. So I thought that was an interesting aspect to it as well. And of course, humanitarian actors will have to deal with within their own organizations with the impact of more insecurity, obviously, just in terms of their own operations in a lot of these places. So it is, I think, a very, very difficult context. We have, all sorts of estimates of how much migration will increase, due to climate change, and I would argue that some of those statistics don't actually even take into account security considerations. They are maybe looking at natural disasters and how, I think the World Bank says, there'll be 140 million people by 2050, moving within their own boundaries. But those studies don't actually take into account, as far as I know, that, if you have climate change leading to more tension, leading to more conflict, that will also lead to more migration as well. And similarly, the statistics that we see on the increase of people needing humanitarian assistance due to climate change, I also don't think they usually consider the conflict dimension and the insecurity dimension. So there is, I think, the other statistic that you'll have 200 million people a year needing humanitarian assistance as a result of climate change, but that's as a result of the disasters and the socioeconomic pressures, and then conflict can come on top of that as well. So it's a very difficult, I suppose, nexus of issues, as I think so many people listening on the call know very intimately. And we'll come back later, maybe to talk a little bit about what we're trying to do about it, and what I'll maybe talk a bit about what's going on at the Security Council to try to address some of this. So thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Sinead. Thanks for that great overview. So, from our expert speakers, what are we seeing here? I mean, I picked up, and I'm sure all have got more from it, but issues related to poverty and increased vulnerability, food security crises, health crises, migration, and related population movements, issues around conflict, around societal breakdown or lack of social structure, damage to social structure, existing conflict around resources potentially being accelerated. All of this occurring on a quite unimaginably massive scale. And all of this sort of leading to a situation where things are bad, they get much worse. For the people who are most marginalized and in need, they become more marginalized, and all in a situation of vicious cycle, where one thing leads inexorably to a worse thing. And all of this, of course, in a situation, as our speakers have pointed out, where financial resources are very, very limited and getting more limited for humanitarian action and crisis response. And whereas Sinead said, the operating context for responses and for humanitarian work in many cases will be much more difficult. It's a really chilling picture our panelists have outlined. So climate change, the climate emergency, is going to be a multi-trillion issue to respond to and to address. And against that, you have a small system. Some people have compared it, I think, to the size of the international bubblegum and chewing gum sector, the humanitarian system, with its perhaps 30 billion against a problem that is going to cost trillions. So the next question I'd like to put to our panel is, in those circumstances then, how do you feel that the humanitarian system, humanitarian actors, can make an effective contribution? And I know, Solomon, that you actually have been making a contribution already with Living Green. Perhaps we could start with that. You told us about the poverty and environmental challenges people around you were experiencing. How do you feel that humanitarians can make a contribution to that? Solomon, over to you.
It seems like we might have lost his connection again here. I will try and reconnect him.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you. While we're waiting for Solomon, who will be telling us, hopefully, about the work that they're doing in southwest Uganda, maybe for a maybe slightly geographically broader view, Magnhild, we could go to you. How do you, sitting in one of the key organizations that's been looking at this issue in the humanitarian sector, what do you think humanitarians should be focusing on?
Thank you, Paul. Humanitarian actors need both to, pull up their sleeves or to clean up our own house through reducing our environmental footprint, and to improve our ability to support the affected population to deal with the impact of climate change. And in NRC, we are committed to do both, But we recognize that this will require a transformative change in the organization, and that we will not be able to get there without help. We will be dependent upon support both from our humanitarian peer organization, our donors, as well as new partnerships with academia and environmental organizations. I mean, NRC, we aim to significantly reduce our environmental footprint to reducing emission from air travel and shifting from the use of generator to clean energy solutions. We are also in our next strategy period focusing on addressing the impact of climate change on the displaced affected population. We do that through our programs, strengthening the resilience of the displacement affected, but also through our advocacy work and strengthening of the protection for those that have been forced to flee due to climate change. But beyond NRC, we as humanitarians need to improve our understanding of the short and longer term impact of climate change on the most vulnerable population and locations, such as people that are already displaced and in country already in crisis or conflict. And we need to scale up our climate risk management and adaptation action to prepare for and respond to growing humanitarian consequences of climate change and build on the increased climate resilience. And we have heard many examples of how climate is affecting displaced populations in today's session. So there is a lot of commitment and dedication, but commitment and dedication will not bring about this change alone. And I mentioned the need for help. It is important for us to improve our work in this area, to be able to rely on support of both other humanitarian organizations and also environmental organizations. And to our donors, we will require financial support to make the needed initial investments and increased flexibility to test out the new financing mechanisms. And I think also we need more standardized requirements for donors so that we can, as a sector, focus capacity building on a limited set of tools. And we need to reach a common understanding of what is good enough in terms of environmental mainstreaming. NRC, we want to continue to deliver life-saving relief, but we also want to reduce the negative impact we have on the environment and support the affected population to address the risk presented by climate change. But as already mentioned, there are existing organizations that have stronger expertise than us on environmental action. And we hope that we will be able to learn from each other, so we are able also to find our complementary roles in addressing this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Magnhild. I think this issue comes up time and time again, and it's something that perhaps humanitarians, the last piece you were speaking about, humanitarians really need to get better at. The issue about working across sectors, the issue about including and talking to and working with people or groups who are outside, if you like, our normal understanding and normal working relationships. And for that reason, I think I'm going to go straight to you, Tasneem, as someone who has a view, perhaps, of that. What do you think, looking at us? What do you think the priorities of humanitarians should be? And I know you brought up some of this thinking earlier, particularly around advocacy and how we should engage for the most marginalised. But maybe you'd like to say a little more on that, or also expand to other areas. Tasneem, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks very much. So I do want to emphasize the scale of the problem. You absolutely correctly indicated that we're talking about trillions, not billions, trillions. And so given that scale, we obviously need to have a system of financial resourcing that firstly creates new and additional resources, not the recycling of resources that we see, well, some countries have now cut ODA funding in this current, which is mind-boggling. But, we get recycled ODA funding that's, considered climate funding, etc. So we do need new and additional resourcing, and we need predictable resourcing. So that cannot only be, a system where we're looking at donations or charity, etc. There has to be a systematic approach to this. And how do we do that? Well, firstly, we are going to need rich countries to step up and do not a charitable act, but to deliver their fair shares of financial resourcing, because, of course, as we know, they have caused the crisis that we are experiencing today. And so they have to do their fair shares. And in addition, we do have the opportunity of mobilizing additional resources through a few things. One, we have to put an end and finally implement the doing away of fossil fuel subsidies, as an example. These are wasted subsidies promoting the very sectors that's causing these crises in the first place. There are many proposals that have been generated, like taxation on a financial transaction tax, etc., that's out there. So, but we need to do this through a systematic approach. There has to be a structured way in which we're able to mobilize the scale of resourcing and then deploy it. And in terms of deployment, of course, resources need to reach those who are affected. There has to be far more localization of resourcing. Local communities know best how to deal with crises, how to build resilience, how to also adapt. So yes, the humanitarian sector obviously plays a very important role in the work they do now, but I would want to add to that and say that their advocacy role becomes far more important. We need to hear from the humanitarian sector in very important decision-making events like the upcoming G7, where 7 of the wealthiest nations are going to be convening, what we need from them. For example, who has the moral authority than those who are actually at the coalface of these crises? So certainly the humanitarian sector needs to step up, and their voice has to be heard, and their voice has to lead in these conversations. We need the humanitarian sector to put loss and damage and the funding of loss and damage firmly on the agenda. There are those who would want to ignore this or pretend there's no such problem as loss and damage, but as a humanitarian sector, because you're dealing with this in your daily work, so let us hear your voice. Last point I want to make, just to emphasize this, I noted that in an October 13th report by the UN Officer for Disaster Risk Reduction, basically a report that looks at the climate and how it's causing increased disaster. This quote just knocked me, and it's from a UN agency. It says, "It is baffling that we willingly and knowingly continue to sow the seeds of our own destruction, despite the science and evidence that we are turning our only home into an uninhabitable hell for millions of people." This is a UN report. Now, we need to hear this from the humanitarian sector. We need to hear what the need is and the scale of the need. We need to hear about the scale of the disaster and the crises. And so this connection between the climate, we cannot operate in these silos any longer. In fact, these silos don't exist necessarily on the ground where the crises are happening. But at this kind of global level, we're going to have to join forces and push for the scale of financing and resourcing that we're going to need to address this huge existential crisis.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tasneem. I'm seeing a lot in the chat. Thanking you for your comments there. As for our other speakers, I think it's particularly salient. I mean, you say so much there, but particularly salient the issue about loss and damage financing, because this is an area where I know a lot of people in the climate finance arena have really been asking for humanitarians to become more involved and to amplify the voices of those people who are already feeling the loss and damage. So that might be a very particular area for some of our participants here to consider how they can engage in those kind of conversations. You were also talking about work on the ground, and I'm delighted that I understand Solomon is back now. So Solomon, can I take the question to you to ask what you think? You were telling us about the impoverishment of the communities that you work with. What do you think humanitarians can do, looking at it from the perspective of someone who's actually there where it's happening?
Give me a second to see here why it's not coming through.
And I believe money will never be enough to address some challenges. The best thing is to see how you can put into good use of that little available money. Because here, as you said, that it addressing the climate crisis may require trillions of dollars. And in case they are around $30 billion, what can they do? Most years, at least the youth have been neglected so much. And the youth have come up with the initiatives that can address challenges in their communities. So I would suggest that this time the youth are also supported directly, because you find we normally have challenges of finances when you are trying to implement some projects. So direct support to youth-led organizations at local levels, it is going to help in addressing such challenges. And also, you find there is also a challenge maybe when you are implementing a given project in a community and you have a specific target of the population, you leave out to others. There are some kinds of tension, conflict. So when you are planning to implement like environmental projects, I know this is a global thing, it affects everyone, meaning everyone should be included. You should not select and leave out others. And what I'm also requesting or recommending the donors and the funders, government, UN, is to make sure that when you are implementing the project, you are involving the local beneficiaries directly. Let them take part in implementing the project, because if you come to implement it for them, what they do, they just become spectators. They watch at you. So this is the time that you have to involve them so that they own the projects that you are implementing to address the environment and climate change. we have local NGOs in place, but in fact, they lack connection with the international NGOs. Yet working together, it was going to address such challenges. But what I've realized, there is a gap, or maybe NGOs are just competing, which is not good. They're supposed to work together. So this is the time you have to look at how all the NGOs, both international and local, plus their beneficiaries, how can all come together, work and fight the crisis of climate change? That's briefly what I can talk about it. So money wouldn't be a very big challenge, but bringing people on board to tackle the effect of climate change. Thank you.
That's great, Solomon. Thank you. And just to underline some of the points that really struck me there, if I may, the money is, of course, vitally important, but actually you need to have something to do with it. You need to know actually how to operationalize the response to climate change. Financing on its own is not enough. And in order to do that, local people and local organizations who have an understanding of the complex social and economic local context are very well placed, best placed to identify what to do. Also, something that comes across, I think, in a lot of these conversations is this localization has the double benefit, not only of more contextually appropriate work, but also of capacity building and empowerment for potentially for marginalized groups, given that so much of the climate change marginalization is a political as much as an economic challenge. Any work that we do to build those capacities is vitally important. So jumping from those very good thoughts, and thank you for those, Solomon, again to, if you like, almost the other end of the spectrum, although of course the two come together in so many places. Sinead, could I put this question to you? What do you think the focus and the contribution of the humanitarian system can be? Again, looking from the sort of Security Council place.
Thanks, Paul, and maybe I'll just start a little bit from where Solomon left off before I get to that. I'm not sure if everybody online will be aware. There is a whole movement within the climate sector to get more financing down to the local level and get more decision making essentially at the local level. There was a set of principles that were launched in January of this year they're called Principles for Local Level Adaptation. And I suspect it's a bit of a conversation in the climate community, and it may not be really kind of filtering across the humanitarian community, but I think there's a lot in there that really resonates with what Solomon was saying, and indeed what Tasneem was saying, and we're Ireland is one of the first signatories of those principles, but also we're involved in an initiative which colleagues also might find interesting, which is called Life AR, which is basically a group of least developed countries sitting in the governance seat, as it were. So that are themselves, forming a board and saying, there's all these international actors funding adaptation. We're not seeing it reach the local level. Only about 10% of the international climate finance that donors are giving is actually reaching the local level. They want to increase that from 10% to 70% by 2030. And so we're one of the funders of that, as are the British government. And I just encourage people to have a look at the particularly those principles for local level adaptation. I think they're on they're certainly on the IED website. But just to come back, and I will come back also to some of the local level points at the end. But just to kind of continue that thread in terms of what the UN Security Council is doing, I mean, I think people online will probably be aware, but I think it only really hits you when you're sitting on the UN Security Council that its brief is really quite limited. It really is about peace and security. You know, generally when we do surveys of our population here in Ireland, people think the Security Council is so powerful and they do all these different things, but they really focus on peace and security. And we've been really, working with other countries, particularly people like Germany, Norway, Niger, and Kenya, to really make the point at the UN Security Council that climate has got to be, a cross-cutting issue. It's got to be considered anytime we talk about peace and security. So, thanks to a lot of hard work, particularly by Germany last year, there was a group set up. So there is now a working group at the Security Council that focuses on climate and what are the impacts, on insecurity, and what can we do about it. So Ireland is actually now co-chairing that along with Niger, which is, a country that has huge experience in this. So we're very happy about that. And some of the things that we're trying to do are, focusing on how UN agencies and missions, and I'm aware that these things often filter down to NGOs. How are they doing, risk analysis? Is the risk analysis they're doing for conflict really bringing in this issue of climate? But also, I think one of the very important things for Ireland is how do we turn this into a more positive situation? So we need to be demonstrating that it's not just that climate change is bad for it causes conflict, causes, war, exacerbates it, but it's also that climate action can be good for peace. And so how do we sort of turn this around? And this is where I think, the work of NGOs on this call is so critical. So we're working through this informal expert group to try to turn the topic a little bit on its head, and to also put some resources behind that so that we have good examples at the country level. So there is, for example, an advisor now in the UN mission in Somalia who focuses only on the impacts of climate and how that affects the insecurity situation. And that's the kind of thing we're looking at doing also elsewhere. But we all know that mainstreaming is difficult. So we need to also learn from how we've done mainstreaming in the past and how we haven't maybe done it well. But just to come to the role of humanitarian NGOs in all of this, I really just wanted to support Tasneem's point about the advocacy. I think humanitarian NGOs are in an excellent position to give examples, that would reach these discussions in the Security Council on what they're seeing on the ground, what is the impact of the climate crisis on humanitarian needs, and why this needs more attention, and also critically examples of good practice where this link has been made. So there has been work, for example, in the Sahel on, how do you work with communities that are, as I mentioned earlier, maybe having a dispute over grazing land. What kind of governance arrangements might you need to put in place at the local level to reorient, different communities who used to work in a certain way to the new reality of climate action? So I think, what would be really amazing is if we have more humanitarian NGOs engaging in this kind of work, trying to show the peace dividends of climate action and how to do adaptation well at the local level, and for that then to be, that I think can really be taken up very powerfully at the global level. But I think it is really important that, coming back to Magnhild's point about getting one's own house in order, that humanitarian NGOs are doing the kind of, the risk assessments and the analysis at their own level. And I think conferences like this are a really good start, but there's probably quite a lot of potential for collective training for humanitarian actors to be able to do this kind of work better, in order then to be able to have those examples that influence the international sphere. And just one final point about funding. There was an ICRC report on this, and they talked about how I mentioned that so little of the climate finance reaches the local level. There's also an issue with very little climate finance reaching conflict-affected countries. So it's almost as though climate is sort of a development issue. And, but if countries in conflict, well, we have bigger problems. We don't talk about climate, but it's really, really critical that we, that the climate finance that is there, which I totally agree is not sufficient, is reaching the local level, but is also reaching the local level in countries that are in conflict. So I'll leave it at that, Paul. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for bringing that up. I mean, there's a theme I'm hearing emerging here, which is the importance for humanitarians, not just in what we're doing, but in how we're doing it, in the processes that we use around capacity building, the processes that we use to ensure that we're considering and working on issues of peace or conflict. Sinead, you mentioned there, I'm going to start moving to some of the many, many questions that are coming up from the participants here today. A question here about peacekeeping and climate, which I'm going to slightly expand, if I may. You mentioned the issue of climate finance not going to conflict environments or fragile states. And of course, conflict environments and fragile states form much of the context for humanitarian work. And in those states, there are often very severe problems around access, not all of which are locally produced. Some of these come out of the securitization agenda of G7 states and Security Council permanent members. How do you think humanitarian organizations should be worrying about climate becoming a security issue? Do you think that's going to have implications for humanitarian access or humanitarian activities if this is seen through a security lens?
Yeah, no, look, that's a good question. I suppose it's incumbent on us all to make sure that doesn't happen. One of the things that we're doing is trying to really work with some of those UN missions on the ground, but there's some very interesting work going on in NATO on this, believe it or not, where the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, used to be the UN Special Envoy for Climate Change. So this is a wonderful opportunity, actually, for all of us to influence this discourse when you have somebody in such a powerful position that really understands the issues of climate change. And he talks about, he mentioned something on a podcast last week. He said, so many of the attacks on NATO troops are actually when they're going to get fuel. So he said there's a lot of these things that are not. This is not altruism. This is sort of safety and security and so on. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do in our work with the Security Council is get the UN missions on the ground to really to look kind of holistically at the the issues of climate, both the risks and the opportunities, and see how they can work. And I don't really know, I suppose, Paul, to answer your question, I don't know, and maybe others, maybe others on the call would have more experience. I haven't really encountered that. I suppose those access issues being present in the countries where I've worked, maybe when you're looking more at the Middle East and so on, maybe that's the case, but others may be able to talk about that. But I think the point is that this discussion is at a relatively early stage, and now is the time to try to influence it in a way that is better for people, which I think is what everybody on this call is engaged with. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you, Sinead. So the call again is to be involved, to involve ourselves. And there was a question, I think that goes to one of the questions from a colleague here, saying how can non-climate-based humanitarian organizations engage with the issue? And it sounds to me like a lot of that answer is at least becoming aware of the issue and where it touches on the work that you are already doing, because there will be multiple points of connection.
Could I just say something brief on
Sure.
that? Sorry, Paul. I just really think it's important for humanitarian actors to recognize that a lot of the skills that are needed for this climate work, they already have, because so much of what we talk about in the adaptation conversations are very much around, risk models, anticipatory action, all this kind of stuff. I mean, this is the bread and butter of humanitarian actors. So just humanitarian actors shouldn't feel, intimidated. Oh, I'm not a climate expert. This is all so different. When it actually comes to the ground level, a lot of it is the same. It's the same stuff. It's just, there's some different content, but it's the same skill set that humanitarian actors have developed over decades that I think would be really useful for engaging in this climate work.
Thank you, Sinead. And I'm going to go to someone who is explicitly very much a climate expert, Tasneem, for the next question, if I may. This is around the mitigation element and the role of humanitarian agencies in mitigation. I'm going to put a couple of questions that have come up together. Obviously, we've talked about the importance of humanitarian organizations mitigating their own impact. Our questioners are asking if you have any thoughts on how we can perhaps go beyond that to assist governments in their processes of mitigation as well, particularly those governments who are limited in terms of finance and capacity to do that. So that's one, if you like, general question, Tasneem, about humanitarians and support to mitigation activities. A specific within that is around working on alternative sources of energy and whether that you see that there are potential ways that humanitarians can engage with support for alternative energy sources. Quite broad questions, but I'll throw them to you for any reflections there.
Thanks, Paul. So, I do want to congratulate the sector for the charter and also to the work that you're going to look at in terms of mitigating in your own sector. That's one piece of it, as you rightly say. The big piece is, and I know also in the question and answer people have asked, I said we have to deal with the climate crisis at its source. And what does that mean? That means that, we have to address the causes of climate. Of course, it's human-induced, it's our own actions, but most importantly, we know already, and the evidence is there, no debates about it, that our economic systems, our unsustainable production and consumption patterns, etc., contribute to the climate crisis. And fundamentally, it is our dependence on fossil fuels. Our dependence on, the way we deal with land use, for example, our transportation systems, industrial systems, all of this needs radical transformation. So how can the humanitarian sector help? Again, highlight, we can't keep on dealing with the crisis and respond and react to it. We do want to stop or at least minimize, because I think the science is showing that potentially, there are tipping points and we might not be able to end the climate crisis, but certainly minimize its dangers. So we have to also deal with that end of the spectrum as the humanitarian sector, to call for an end to, and it's not stopping. Our greenhouse gas emissions are still continuing. It's rising. So we have to also raise our voice around that. On the alternative energy piece, I think that there's such an important role, because as you said, and Sinead said that, things are happening on the ground already. We have access to renewable energy. There's just been a recent IEA report. It would be really good for everybody in your sector to read the report, basically saying achieving a 1.5 limit to temperature warming is possible, and we can do it in the energy sector. And that renewable energy is viable, feasible, and becoming more and more affordable. Of course, we have to address the resourcing for those living in least developing countries to do that. But at the community level, one of the important ways that you potentially can build resilience and support economic empowerment, etc., is through decentralized renewable energy options, which can be off-grid options as well. You don't need to have massive infrastructure. We're not utilizing that enough. I have also, we promote the idea, for example, of energy democracy. That means local communities have the ability to, in fact, own the means of production of electricity. It doesn't have to be big companies coming into your community and delivering this. So the way we also do the work on the ground can be informed by alternative approaches, whether that's in agroecology, so the way we produce food, whether this is alternative energy systems. These are all part of building resilience. And the IPCC has made it very clear, what do we mean by building resilience? Well, fundamentally addressing issues of poverty and inequality, ensuring social justice for communities who are most marginalized. So again, the point that Sinead makes, these things you do already. These things need to be connected.
I'm going to, with that, I mean, what I'm loving about this, both you and Sinead, identifying ways that crisis can be opportunity, that we can use leverage for peace, we can leverage for decentralization. And that, I think, is a really powerful message. We've got lots of questions have come in about sort of examples, about how-to humanitarian examples. And of course, one of the things about the climate emergency is that we're only starting to learn what works. But for both you, Solomon, and you, Magnhild, I'm gonna put three of these questions together and ask you to, and I'm afraid time is our enemy here, but ask you very briefly to respond to one or two of them, which you think are the most salient. And so these would be, do you have examples of making partnerships around climate change work? What does it take? That's one question. Do you have examples of adaptive strategies? How to set up an adaptation for recurrent crises like recurrent flooding, recurrent drought, and what works there? That's another question. Do you have examples of how to get the balance right between activism and advocacy on the one hand and operations on the other? So balancing advocacy and operations, adaptive strategies for recurrent crises, examples of partnerships. Magnhild, could I go to you for any NRC good examples in any of those areas?
Thank you. I just want to follow up on what we have done on the working on clean energy. I mean, I've talked about the need for the organization to roll up its sleeves and to do to make transformative changes, but we are working together with UNHCR on the clean energy challenge, where we are both working on greening our operation and increasing access to clean energy for affected populations. And we are in some of our countries where we are working on both to use Yemen and Somalia as examples where we are balancing where we are working on of course, conflict-induced displacement, but we're also working on addressing sudden onset crisis. But where we see that we really heavily depend upon is that we have funding mechanisms so we can address these sudden onset crises that are happening. But as I mentioned, I think it is for NRC, it is we are in this phase now where we are embarking on a new strategy, working towards our 2030 ambition. And it will be important for us going forward to share the various experience we have, both at country level, but also more at an overall level on the changes we want to do, and also to talk about the challenges that we are facing openly with humanitarian organizations and also with environmental organizations. So that will be my response. Yeah.
Thank you. And we very much look forward to finding out more about that and about the lessons that you're harvesting and that others are harvesting. I see do look everyone in the chat, there's a request for case studies there, which anyone who has case studies perhaps could respond to. Solomon, you are, of all of us, I think, physically the closest to the ravages of the climate crisis. Any good experiences from you about work for recurrent droughts or about partnerships, bringing different actors together to work on these? You have the last word, Solomon, from the panel.
Oh, yeah. After I tried to move around all the refugee settlements here in Uganda and discovered that most of the challenges that are affecting refugees is poverty, environmental degradation.
Oh, I think we may have lost you, Solomon.
That was his phone connection dying. Okay, try there instead, Solomon.
Yeah, I'm saying, yes, Paul.
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Now we found out that it is poverty that is affecting many people, and they end up even going to deplete the already degraded environment. Now at Living Green, we came up with an alternative source of livelihood, where we are raising trees, mainly fruit trees, that take few years to start fruiting. That's around 3 to 4 years. You find that after 3 to 4 years, if you have planted grafted mangoes and the oranges, a farmer or maybe someone is able to start earning income as an alternative instead of only depending on farming, maybe growing only maize and beans and the others that keep on depleting the environment. What we do, we give out seedlings to refugees and the host communities. They plant. Within a few years, they start now harvesting and earning money. And what we do, we also do community mobilization and sensitization on environment. So to make it easy, we went to each village and formed youth groups that help in mobilizing the entire village about the importance of planting trees and protecting the environment. We go on also to organize workshops and trainings. We target mainly the youth because we know the youth can, they have that ability to carry on the information and spread it to the entire communities. We train them on how to protect the environment. Again, thanks goes to the office of the Prime Minister here in Uganda. They allocated the piece of land to Living Green, where Living Green has been able to set plantations. And these plantations also act as a training ground for the beneficiaries.
Thank you, Solomon. I'm gonna just because of time, I'm gonna stop you there. But that's an excellent example, I think, of government, civil society, international community, because I know UNHCR was involved as well, working together on a piece of work, and the sort of thing, of course, we need to see so much more of. So thank you for that. So I hope we have managed between us to, I mean, we could have talked more and more with all the great questions that came in and the knowledge we have on this panel, but I hope we've started at least to frame the issue of climate change and humanitarianism. What I'm hearing is that this is at the heart of our work. It's not a specialization. It's not something that, we need an expert to deal with. Climate change is at the heart of humanitarian work. I'm hearing that humanitarians have something to offer, should be at the table because we bring knowledge which is useful to others. And I'm hearing that our responses to climate change are about what we do, but also hugely about how we go about doing those things, thinking about our work through a climate lens. I wish that we were able to all applaud our marvelous panel. We can't do that because of the nature, but I hear in my head thunderous applause. So thank you, Solomon. Thank you, Magnhild. Thank you, Tasneem. And thank you, Sinead, so much, all four of you. And I will now hand over to Nishani to tell us what's going to happen next.
Hello, everyone. Indeed, it was an amazing panel and really rich discussions. We will continue these discussions in our World Cafe session 2, which will start at 2 p.m. CST, Geneva, Paris time. And on the screen, you can see the timings around the world that you can join in. So we hope you will join in on that. And I will also share with you the link for the session. So you have in advance some of the sessions that are going to take place. So you can see them. Give me a second. And we hope that we'll join you soon. And we hope to hear from you. And thank you very much, Paul, everyone behind the scenes, the interpreters, sign language, all our staff who've been at the back end doing this amazing job getting everybody on board. So thank you very much.